Imagine a massive national financial shock where the math literally does not change.
Like not by a single fraction of a cent.
Exactly. It's January 1st, 2026.
Yeah.
Bulgaria officially becomes the 21st member of the euro area.
Right.
And the exchange rate locks in at exactly €1 to 1.95583 Bulgarian leva.
Which is, usually when we talk about a major currency event, you expect absolute chaos.
Oh, yeah. You expect stock markets to tremor or like people to rush the banks, right?
Yeah.
Or foreign exchange boards to just light up in red.
Yeah, total panic.
But here, the math was just a completely flat line.
Well, the transition on paper was seamless because, and this is key, that specific 1.95583 exchange rate wasn't new.
Right.
It was a number baked into the Bulgarian economy for nearly 30 years.
I mean, I need to pause this right there. Because if you are listening to this deep dive and you aren't, a Forex trader, that sounds impossible.
It really does.
Like, how does a country join the euro and experience zero mathematical change on day one?
Right. It seems like magic.
Yeah. So we need to explain the mechanics of this because the sources point out Bulgaria had been operating under something called a currency board system.
Right.
So how does a currency board actually work to freeze that math?
So think of a currency board as basically a financial straitjacket that a central bank voluntarily puts on.
Okay.
Normally, a central bank can just print money whenever it wants to stimulate the economy, right? Or it can let the value of its currency float up and down based on global supply and demand.
Right, like the US dollar or the British pound.
Exactly. But under a currency board, the central bank gives up that power entirely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they make a legally binding promise.
Yeah.
Basically, for every single Bulgarian lev in circulation, the central bank holds the equivalent amount of euros in its reserves to back it up.
So it's essentially a modern gold standard.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
But instead of holding physical gold bricks in a vault somewhere, the Bulgarian central bank is just holding digital euros.
Exactly. They couldn't print a new lev unless they had a new euro to put in the vault. That is the exact mechanism. And by doing that, they artificially pegged the lev to the euro at that exact 1.95583 ratio.
Then the market just accepts that.
Well, the market couldn't break the peg because the central bank always had the euros to buy back the leva if anyone tried to bet against it.
Ah, I see.
So when January 1st, 2026 rolled around, the math didn't change because the lev had effectively been a euro in disguise for decades.
That's wild.
Yeah, so if you had the equivalent of 100 euros in leva on December 31st, you had exactly 100 euros in physical euro bills on January 1st.
Right. But, mathematically is not how human beings actually live their lives.
No, not at all.
Emotionally, socially, practically. The change felt like a seismic shift across the entire country.
Oh, absolutely.
So if the math did not change at all, why did the entire country feel it so deeply?
That is the big question.
Right. So we're going to unpack the stack of sources we have gathered to explore how this single change in currency presentation completely rewrote the psychology of the local wallet.
It's a huge psychological shift.
It really is. And we're going to look at how it transformed international property investment strategies overnight.
Which is a massive part of the data.
And how it created this high-stakes tension between local rural economies and European-level expectations.
Okay.
Let's unpack this.
Yeah. To understand the tension, we really have to establish what a currency actually is to the human brain.
Okay, lay it on me.
A currency is not just a medium of exchange. It is a language of value.
A language of value.
Right. When a country changes its financial language, it changes how it is seen by the rest of the world.
Sure.
But more fundamentally, it changes how the country sees itself. You cannot just swap out the vocabulary people use to measure their survival and expect their psychology to remain static.
No, of course not.
No.
To really get a grip on that language, we need to start at the absolute smallest scale.
The individual wallet.
Exactly. Before we look at global investment capital moving across borders, we have to understand how the perception of a single coin changes your daily life. Think about the last time you traveled to a country with a drastically different currency.
Oh, it's exhausting.
Right. Remember that exhaustion of dividing everything by 15 or multiplying by 40 in your head just to buy a bottle of water?
Yeah, you're just standing there staring at your phone calculator.
Exactly. Now imagine being forced to do that in the grocery store you've shopped at for 30 years. Let's look at the cognitive load of mental conversion.
Yeah, the behavioral economics in the sources really highlight how human brains process numbers under stress. People do not spend money with calculators. They spend money with habit.
Habit, right.
Let's look at the microtransactions that dictate the rhythm of a day. A coffee that a local has bought every morning for years costs 2.50 leva.
Okay.
Suddenly, the menu board says 1.28.
Right.
A daily lunch that was 20 leva now says 10.23. The numbers physically shrink on the page.
And the brain naturally assumes a smaller number implies a cheaper cost, right?
Usually, yes.
But because the brain also knows a currency switch just happened, it throws up this immediate defense mechanism.
It suspects a trick.
Exactly.
The psychological friction really comes from the disruption of what's called System 1 thinking.
Right. Daniel Kahneman's stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Kahneman's framework of System 1 is our fast, automatic, intuitive thought process.
Like driving a car on a familiar road.
Exactly. When you've lived with the lev your whole life, knowing what 20 leva feels like is System 1. It requires zero effort.
You just know it.
Right. But the introduction of the euro forced the entire population into System 2 thinking, which is the slow, deliberate, analytical part of the brain.
So you are standing in an aisle, looking at a bag of flour priced at 1.50.
And your brain has to manually multiply that by roughly 1.95 to figure out if you're being ripped off.
Man, doing manual division and multiplication for every single item in a grocery cart sounds absolutely exhausting.
It's a huge cognitive load.
You're trying to buy a sack of animal feed, a bus fare, a loaf of bread, and suddenly you are basically taking a math test.
It created a prolonged period where Bulgaria became a country thinking in two currencies at once.
The dual currency brain.
Exactly. The population was handing over physical euros at the cash register, but they were judging the fairness of the transaction entirely in the ghost of the lev.
Wow. Let's apply that cognitive load to the demographic most vulnerable to it.
The pensioners.
Yes, the pensioners. We really need to dive into this because the sources go deep into how this euro transition affects the daily living costs for local Bulgarian pensioners.
It's a critical part of the data.
If you are managing a strict fixed pension, you don't have the luxury of absorbing a miscalculation.
No, not at all.
Every single cent is literally a matter of basic survival. This transition wasn't some abstract macroeconomic debate happening in Parliament.
Right. It was an intense kitchen table crisis.
Exactly. Can you describe how the euro affects the daily living costs for local Bulgarian pensioners in practice?
Well, pensioners operate on hyper-calibrated budgets. They know exactly which shop down the street is cheaper for cooking oil and which market stall gives the best price on seasonal vegetables.
Right. They have it all mapped out.
Yeah, so when the prices shifted into euros, the smaller numbers felt incredibly deceptive to them, triggering a constant visceral feeling of expense.
Because they lose their anchors?
Exactly. A 10 meal doesn't sound astronomical to an outsider, right?
Right.
But to a pensioner whose brain eventually snaps back to the realization that they just spent 20 leva, it induces panic.
It's like trying to read a novel you've known by heart your entire life, but someone translated it into a language you only kind of understand.
This is a really good analogy.
Like the plot is identical, the characters are exactly the same, but the rhythm of reading is completely destroyed.
Yeah, you have to pause, translate every sentence in your head.
And you just lose the flow of the story. You never get to just naturally exist in the narrative anymore.
Right.
For these pensioners, they couldn't naturally exist in their own neighborhood supermarkets.
The environment is physically identical, but the rhythm of survival has been stripped away. And, when survival feels threatened, people look for a culprit.
I mean, naturally.
Yeah.
But I have to challenge the premise that the euro is the sole culprit here.
Oh, absolutely. It's not.
Right. Let's look at the global macroeconomic context in early 2026. Global inflation was a persistent issue everywhere.
Right. It wasn't just Bulgaria.
Supply chain disruptions were still echoing across Europe. Energy costs were fluctuating wildly, and fuel prices were high.
Yeah, very high.
These inflationary pressures were happening globally, regardless of what currency a country was using.
Exactly.
So why does the euro take the blame for the feeling that life in Bulgaria is getting more expensive?
Well, because macroeconomics is entirely abstract to the person on the street.
That's fair.
You cannot point your finger at global supply chain disruption or the geopolitical price of natural gas when you are arguing with a baker over the price of a pastry,
Right, you can't exactly yell at the concept of global inflation.
Exactly. Human beings need a tangible symbol for their anxiety.
And the euro was literally in their hands.
Right. The physical arrival of the euro coincided perfectly with an era where the cost of living was a major global worry.
So the euro was the physical object they were holding. Right as prices were creeping up naturally, it became the scapegoat.
Completely. If the mechanic charged more to fix a tractor, the farmer didn't blame global steel shortages.
Or blame the euro.
Exactly. Imported inflation, rising fuel costs, even seasonal crop failures, all of it was psychologically conflated with the currency change.
Wow.
And because every single individual felt financially vulnerable and was constantly doing this mental math, an immediate magnifying glass was placed on local businesses.
Okay, yeah.
This created a highly volatile trust economy.
I mean, if my own brain is exhausting me with mental math, I am inherently going to be suspicious of the vendor doing the math on the other side of the counter.
Right, you're already on edge.
Let's dig into that trust deficit. The sources detail the physical handling of cash in rural villages.
This is a really interesting part.
Yeah, let's say a local shopkeeper sells an item that used to cost 2 leva. Mathematically, that is 1.02.
Okay.
To avoid dealing with microscopic 1 and 2 cent coins, the shopkeeper rounds the price up to 1.20.
Which makes sense practically.
Right, but that's an 8-cent difference. The community is going to spot that instantly.
Oh, immediately. In rural Bulgaria, cash dictates the social fabric. We are talking about paying your neighbor to chop firewood, paying the local plumber, or tipping a delivery driver.
Right.
These are small, informal, trust-based transactions that have functioned the exact same way for decades.
And suddenly that's upended.
Yeah, when you introduce unfamiliar coins and notes into that delicate ecosystem, people become highly defensive.
They scrutinize receipts?
They recount their change, yeah. If one shop is perceived as rounding up unfairly, even by a few cents just to make giving change easier, the word spreads through a village community like a virus.
So the local service sector gets squeezed.
Big time.
And that squeeze gets infinitely tighter when you introduce foreigners into the local ecosystem, right?
Oh, absolutely. That changes the whole dynamic.
Suddenly, a tourist or a British expat looks at a menu or gets a quote from a local builder, and they are no longer trying to decipher the value of the lev.
They're looking at euros.
Exactly. They can instantly compare a village builder's quote to the cost of living in Munich or Manchester.
And what's fascinating here is how that clarity completely strips away the protective layer of obscurity that local businesses used to enjoy.
Explain that. What do you mean by obscurity?
Well, before the euro, a foreign resident might get a quote for a plumbing job in leva.
Okay.
Because it was in a foreign currency, it naturally felt local.
Right.
The expat might struggle to accurately convert it in their head, but they would basically assume, I'm in Bulgaria, things are generally cheap, I'll pay it.
Gotcha.
It was local pricing shrouded in mental friction.
But post-euro, let's look at a concrete example from the sources. A local builder quotes 15,000 euro to repair a roof. That figure is instantly legible to a buyer from Germany or Ireland.
Crystal clear.
They know exactly what 15,000 buys in their home country. Because they are paying a quote-unquote European price, they suddenly demand European-level transparency.
Exactly. They want a digitized, written quote.
Right. They want structural guarantees. They want a phased breakdown of labor costs versus material costs.
Right, which leads us to outline how local service providers must improve quality to stay competitive.
But wait, does writing the euro symbol on an invoice magically give a rural builder the operational capacity of a German contracting firm?
Definitely not.
Right. Paying in euros doesn't turn a village cafe into a high-end Vienna coffee house overnight.
It absolutely doesn't, and that really exposes the gap between perception and reality.
Yeah.
The currency changed in a single night, but the local infrastructure, the complex supply chains, the local cost base, and the traditional informal working practices remained exactly the same.
So these local businesses were basically forced into a rapid, often painful process of professionalization.
Right, exactly.
They have to upgrade their entire operational model
Right.
just to justify the numbers that are now globally visible.
Yeah, outline how local service providers must improve quality to stay competitive, right? If a local tradesperson wants to charge a price that is easily comparable to Western Europe, they have to deliver a service that matches the Western European expectation of that price point.
Where else? Why?
Otherwise, the expat accuses them of price gouging.
Oh, wow.
This forces better business practices, clearer invoices, cleaner presentation, reliable booking systems.
Which sounds good on paper.
It does, but it places an enormous crushing stress on small family-run businesses that are not capitalized or prepared for a client base that is suddenly aggressively demanding.
Yeah, that's rough. We're seeing a massive escalation here.
Definitely.
We've moved from the microeconomy of groceries causing a cognitive load to the small business economy suffering a trust deficit, and now we are hitting the macroeconomy of capital.
The big leagues.
Exactly. Because if the euro removes the hiding places for a local plumber, it completely demolishes the walls surrounding the entire Bulgarian real estate market.
Oh, it blows the doors right off.
Let's really dig into how the euro changes property investment strategies.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
The sources describe a historical two-layered property market. Break down the mechanics of that for us.
So the two-layered market was essentially a psychological and practical divide in valuations.
Okay.
In the local domestic market, everything was negotiated, conceptualized, and understood in leva.
Right.
Sellers anchored their expectations in leva, builders priced their raw materials in leva.
Makes sense.
But to attract international buyers, real estate agents would list properties online in euros.
Ah, I see.
So there was always this invisible translation layer. A property might be advertised to a foreigner at 20,000 euro, but the local seller was really anchoring their emotional attachment to 40,000 leva.
It's like trying to buy a stock in a dark pool where you aren't quite sure of the real-time ticker price.
That's a brilliant way to look at it.
You know you are buying an asset, but you can't be confident you understand the underlying valuation because it is constantly shifting through a currency translation you don't organically feel.
Right. But the adoption of the euro acted like a massive stadium light turning on over the market.
The dark pool is lit up.
Exactly. The disconnect was eradicated. A price became just a price.
Yeah.
50,000 in a Bulgarian village is now identical to 50,000 in Berlin or Dublin or Madrid.
There is no second layer.
There is no hidden translation.
And that single piece of pricing clarity completely rewrites the investment decision-making process for foreign property buyers.
Completely.
We really need to explain how the euro changes property investment strategies here. Previously, Bulgaria was viewed as cheap but mysterious.
Right. Very risky.
As an investor, you had to calculate currency risk constantly. If the lev somehow unpegged, or if transaction fees ate into your margins, your investment was compromised.
Yeah, it was a gamble.
But now, a buyer sitting in an office in Ireland can open up an Excel spreadsheet and put a 25,000 Bulgarian rural home in the exact same column as a 25,000 renovation project in rural Spain or a distressed asset in Italy.
And the currency risk is zero.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The mental friction is gone. It is a direct apples-to-apples comparison.
That kind of clarity is a profound magnet for serious institutional and private capital.
I bet.
When a country adopts the euro, it broadcasts a massive macroeconomic signal to the broader market.
What's the signal?
It effectively says, this economy is now permanently aligned with the European core.
Wow, yeah.
To an investor, that implies legal stability, predictable financial frameworks, and fully integrated banking systems.
Which are huge factors.
Huge. When an investor sees that, their primary fear, which is uncertainty, drops significantly.
So to really analyze how the euro changes investment decision-making processes for foreign property buyers, the spreadsheet works now because the variables are locked.
Exactly.
They can calculate the purchase price, legal fees, material costs for renovation, and expected long-term rental yield, all in one unified currency.
Without worrying that an unpredictable exchange rate fluctuation will wipe out a decade of profit margin.
Right. And because the market is completely visible and comparable, the actual behavioral type of the person buying these properties fundamentally shifts.
Oh, the buyer profile completely changes.
Yeah, we see a stark contrast between the buying habits of emotional investors versus analytical investors.
And this is what the sources call the rural awakening.
Let's contrast those buyers. Before the euro, the buyers heading into emerging village markets, places like Popovo, Targoviste, or Razgrad, were often emotional buyers.
Right, the emotional buyer.
Explain the emotional buyer.
So the emotional buyer looked at a drastically low price in a foreign currency and thought, this is incredibly cheap, it's a minimal risk, let's buy a house in a Bulgarian village for an adventure.
Like an impulse buy.
It was very impulsive. Often these buyers didn't have a plan for renovation, they didn't understand the local climate, and they certainly weren't calculating yield.
Post-euro, though, the buyer sitting at that clean, frictionless spreadsheet isn't an emotional adventurer.
No, they are a completely different beast.
They're analytical.
Highly analytical. They are looking strictly at return on investment.
Right, so we contrast the buying habits of emotional versus analytical investors in the current market. The analytical ones are calculating exit strategies, long-term yield, and cost per square meter.
Exactly. A property listed at $8,000 is no longer categorized as a weird cheap house in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
On an investor's spreadsheet, it is categorized as a low-entry investment vehicle.
Wow.
A $30,000 to property is a manageable renovation with significant value creation potential.
That framing changes the entire physical landscape of the village.
It really does.
They aren't buying an adventure, they are buying an asset class. Yeah. They're comparing the capital required for that $15,000 house directly to the deposit required for an apartment in London. Bulgaria officially enters the serious, ruthless financial decision-making process of the European middle-class investor.
It's pure economics now.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay.
Let's analyze the long-term risks for rural markets. If everyone across Europe suddenly views these deeply rural, quiet Bulgarian villages purely as spreadsheet investments, doesn't that just invite pure, soulless speculation?
That is a very valid concern.
Like, does the village just become a playground for foreign capital to park itself? You get people flipping houses from their laptops in London without ever caring about the community infrastructure.
Well, the data presents a complex picture on that.
Tell me more.
On one side, the analytical approach actually leads to significantly better planned, more structured local development.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When emotional buyers bought impulsively, they would often strip the roof off a house, realize renovation was hard, and just abandon the project.
Leaving a blighted ruin in the middle of the village.
Exactly. But analytical buyers come heavily prepared.
Right, they have a plan.
They arrive with budgets, timelines, and architectural plans. They finish the renovations because they legally have to secure their yield to satisfy their spreadsheets.
So the village gets fewer abandoned, half-finished ruins. The housing stock actually improves.
It does, but you are right to highlight the volatility of speculation. And we have to evaluate how the currency shift might impact long-term property values in emerging village markets.
Right, the long-term risks for rural markets.
Speculators enter the market looking for undervalued geographic pockets to buy into before they take off.
Looking for the next big thing.
Yeah. When you direct an influx of analytical foreign capital into a small village, it artificially inflates local affordability.
Oh, I see.
The local sellers start looking at the market and thinking, if foreigners are buying and if property prices are rising everywhere else in Europe, what is my family home really worth?
So prices just shoot up.
The local asking prices begin to creep up, completely disconnected from the actual local earning power.
Which brings us to a massive collision. We have this relentless influx of analytical foreign capital flowing into the rural areas, and it is driving straight into the reality of the locals we talked about at the very beginning.
The pensioners.
Right, the pensioners, the workers who are exhausted by the cognitive load of buying groceries. This creates a severe societal fracture.
It really does.
The phrase that encapsulates this fear in the sources is chilling. European prices, Bulgarian wages.
Yeah, that phrase is everywhere in the data.
Let's evaluate the risk of the two-speed Bulgaria where growth unevenly favors accessible regions.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that phrase represents the profound risk of a two-speed economic growth model.
Break that down.
The visibility that the euro brings acts like a massive magnifying glass. It focuses a ton of investment heat onto these regions, but if you hold a magnifying glass in one place too long...
Things catch fire.
Exactly. On one side, you have one Bulgaria, the accessible areas, the picturesque regions, the places with established expat communities.
Right.
This Bulgaria receives rapid investment, surging property values, and deep integration into the global economy.
And the other Bulgaria.
The remote, less visible rural areas that fail to attract that analytical capital. They face continued population decline and economic stagnation. They are left behind as the rest of the country accelerates.
That's the two-speed economic growth where rural regions lag behind cities.
Exactly. But the tension is actually worst in the areas that do see the investment.
Wait, really? Why?
Because if property prices and the daily cost of services align with European standards, but local salaries, pensions, and local incomes do not rise at the exact same speed.
The locals are essentially evicted from their own geography.
Exactly.
So let's explore if wage growth is likely to align with rising European-level costs.
It's a huge question.
Because if you are living in the village your family has inhabited for generations, and suddenly the local cafe charges Vienna prices, the local houses trade at Spanish renovation rates, but your paycheck is exactly what it was 3 years ago.
Right.
That isn't just an economic problem. That is a formula for extreme social unrest.
Absolutely. The economic theory suggests that as foreign capital flows in and businesses professionalize, local wages should naturally rise to meet the new economic baseline.
Theories versus reality, though.
Right. Wage growth is notoriously sticky. It lags behind inflation and property values by years.
Years.
Yes. In the interim, the tension is brutal. Integration benefits the capital-holding outsiders significantly faster than it benefits the wage-earning locals.
Which is just a classic economic trap. Sitting right on the fault line of this tension is the third group in this ecosystem, the expats.
Right, the foreign residents.
The foreign residents who actually live in these rural villages year-round.
Yeah.
We need to highlight how currency clarity changes the daily life of foreign residents.
It's night and day for them.
Yeah, for a retiree from Germany or the UK, explain how the currency shift changes long-term retirement and investment planning for foreign residents.
Well, for the expat, the financial friction of living abroad drops to near absolute zero.
That sounds amazing.
It is. Their foreign pensions are paid directly in euros. Their cross-border taxes are calculated in euros.
Right.
And bank transfers back to their home countries are frictionless.
Well, it's just incredibly easy.
Yeah, there are no exchange rate fees eroding their income, no mental gymnastics required to figure out if they can afford to replace their car this year.
Wow.
They can track maintenance costs, rental income, and property values with absolute perfect clarity. It makes Bulgaria vastly easier to navigate financially.
But I want to explore the social integration aspect of this.
Okay.
If an expat and a local neighbor are finally speaking the exact same financial language, they're both holding the exact same euro coin at the exact same market, does the euro make social integration easier for new expats?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah. Doesn't a shared currency create a shared reality that brings people together?
Counterintuitively, the sources suggest it might actually make social integration much harder.
Really? How so?
Because a shared currency absolutely does not mean shared living standards.
Uh-huh.
What the euro actually does is strip away the polite illusion of the exchange rate, revealing the stark cultural and economic differences that were always there.
Walk me through a scenario. How does holding the same coin reveal the difference?
Imagine an expat and a local worker are sitting at adjacent tables in a village restaurant.
Okay.
The bill for each table comes to 15 euro. The expat, who earns a pension generated by a much stronger Western economy, looks at that 15 euro and thinks, this is incredibly cheap. What a wonderful, affordable lifestyle I have found.
Okay.
The local worker, earning a local wage that has not yet caught up to European standards, looks at the exact same 15 euro bill and sees an inaccessible luxury that they have to save up for. They are looking at the same numeric value, speaking the same financial language, but they are experiencing two entirely hostile economic realities.
The expat can no longer politely ignore the disparity because the math is staring them right in the face.
Exactly. It forces a heavy ethical tension onto the expats.
That makes a lot of sense.
They possess the massive advantage of strong foreign capital. They have to become deeply mindful of how their purchasing power impacts the local environment.
Right, like if an expat eagerly pays inflated prices simply because it's cheap compared to London, they are inadvertently driving up the cost of living for the local who cannot compete with that capital.
Yes. The expat gains immense banking convenience, but they have to navigate the reality that their presence is contributing to the very pricing pressure their neighbors are terrified of.
It is a razor-thin balance. We really have to discuss the balance between easier banking and potentially higher costs for local services that the entire village relies on.
It's a trade-off.
The euro makes the Bulgarian economy infinitely easier for the outside world to understand, but possibly more exposed to this relentless, homogenizing European pricing pressure.
It creates unshakable confidence for the foreign investor, but immense existential concern for the local who fears being left behind in a two-speed economy.
And both of those realities are happening simultaneously in the exact same village square.
Which is wild to think about.
So, what does this all mean? Let's synthesize this incredible deep dive.
Okay.
We started with the paradox that the math of the exchange rate did not alter a single digit of actual wealth.
Right. Because of the currency board, 1 euro is always basically 1.95 leva.
Exactly. But by simply changing the presentation, by changing the language of value, the euro completely rewired Bulgaria's positioning in the global market.
It shifted the country from being perceived as undervalued, slightly mysterious, and mentally taxing to being visible, standardized, and perfectly measurable on an investor's spreadsheet.
And as we have seen with the professionalization of the service sector and the influx of analytical real estate capital, when a market becomes measurable, it evolves at light speed.
It is the brutal visibility of the euro that drives the evolution.
Brutal visibility. I like that.
Yeah, you can no longer hide behind the complexity of a local currency or the friction of an exchange rate.
Right.
Every grocery store price, every rural real estate listing is out in the open, competing directly on a continental stage.
We have spent this entire hour analyzing the mechanics of money. We've unpacked the cognitive load of grocery shopping, the trust deficit between local businesses and buyers, the meticulous spreadsheets of real estate investors, and the deep anxiety of uneven economic growth.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed but pivots to a completely different kind of question.
Okay, what is it?
We've talked extensively about the wallet, but what about the soul of a nation?
Oh, wow. That is the ultimate unspoken question of European integration.
Think back to our overarching theme. We established that a currency is a language of value,
Right.
but a national currency is also a physical artifact that carries the memory, the history, and the independence of a culture.
Mm-hmm.
The lev was distinctly, historically, Bulgarian. What happens to the unique, localized identity of Bulgaria a generation from now, when its most fundamental daily interaction, buying a loaf of bread, paying a neighbor to chop firewood, has been entirely replaced by a standardized continental import?
It's a profound question.
Can a country fully integrate its economy, turn on those fluorescent lights of global visibility, and attract all that lucrative foreign capital without accidentally erasing the very cultural distinctiveness that made people want to visit and live there in the first place?
Right.
When the economic waters are no longer murky and every single transaction is cleanly categorized in euros, do you lose the magic of the landscape? It is something to think about.